Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, everyone. Today we have, like many people, because of Donald Trump, we've been pushed into an emergency episode with none other than the august personality that is Sami Hamdi. Sami, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ibrahim.
Sami is probably someone that most Muslims at this point in the UK know very well. He's a leading geopolitical risk analyst, risk consultant, and he's got more than a decade's experience covering basically everything and anything to do with geopolitics in the Middle East, North Africa, and globally as well. He's often on Al Jazeera, Sky News, BBC. He's advised governments, corporates, NGOs, and he's also been on the IFG. I don't know where that ranks in your list of accolades, Sami.
At the
top. And I'm really excited to have you here with us, because I could think of no one else who could actually make sense of all of this noise and the political chips that should be thrown up in the air by Donald Trump, to be able to figure out where we think they would land at the end. So without further ado, what I want to do is I'll provide the economic tidbits. We're going to hand over to you for the real geopolitical juice in terms of what's happening, and we're going to go around the world in a whistle-stop tour, like around the world in 80 days, but more like 60 minutes. And we're going to start with the Middle East and understand what's going on there. We're going to go to China, Southeast Asia, and then we're going to come back to Russia and Europe. We'll stop over in the UK, and then we'll end up in the USA, what's going to actually happen there as well. Does that sound like a plan?
Fantastic. Let's go.
Let's do it. So Sami, the Middle East, it seems to have got off relatively lightly with these tariffs, where with everyone else, some of them have been slapped up to 40, 50, 60, not even 70, 80%, right? Whereas with the Middle East, he's kept it relatively contained with a lot of the countries that, are in the GCC, although with some of them, he's gone a little bit higher with countries like Jordan in particular that have suffered, and I forget the other one, but there's two countries that he's given a little bit of a higher tariff to. How do we think this whole tariff war potentially is going to affect the Middle East, and in this coming geopolitical order, what's going to happen?
I think that it's important to remember what the priorities are for the Middle East states in particular. We're talking about the big ones like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, like Qatar, like Turkey, and the like. I think for these countries, the aim has been, how do we get US to invest in our economies? How do we get US money to flow into our economies instead of constantly giving money to the US? We've seen that, for example, some of the diversification projects that we've seen in the Middle East, we've seen there have been reports that they're slowing down, that perhaps they haven't garnered the amount of investment that was initially hoped for. And there is a suggestion that one of the reasons that it hasn't garnered the investment that it seeks is primarily because of a cold shoulder from the previous Biden administration, and also concerns that the Trump administration is less inclined to invest abroad and more inclined to keep money within the United States itself. And without that vote of confidence from the US, everybody else seems to hesitate in terms of the economic opportunities that these Middle East states provide. So while it's true that they may have got off lightly with regards to the tariffs, I do think there will be deep concern in some of these major capitals, given that they believe that this is an indication that Trump is looking to get money into the US without necessarily allowing money to leave the US. And I think this poses a significant problem, given that the expectation was that if Biden left the White House, the cold shoulder would be finished and there would be an affirmation of projects such as Vision 2030, of various different investment in economies such as Egypt and UAE and the like. And Trump with these tariffs is now affirming the alternative. The problem is further compounded in that these tariffs do appear to be targeting China in particular, often considered as an alternative to the US with regards to investment. You'll remember that Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, he was received in Saudi Arabia with a big pomp and red carpet treatment at a time when the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman wanted to spite the US as a result of their cold shoulder. However, the lack of development in these economic ties with China indicates that the Saudis in particular, and the UAE and Qataris and these others, still believe that America is the dream ally that they want to invest within their economies. The problem now is that if Trump is indicating that he's not willing to put money into those economies, he's not willing to give them the vote of confidence that they are so desperately seeking so that they can encourage other investors to come, can they go to China? If the tariffs are targeting China, then the suggestion is that if they do shift towards China in a way that the UAE tried to do 2-3 years ago when it signed sweeping technological arrangements, Abdul Khalik Abdullah, a very prominent UAE academic, famously tweeted that when we were given the choice, quote, these are his words, when we were given the choice between American F-15 and F-16s and Chinese technology, we chose Chinese technology. The US forced the UAE to roll back on a lot of these technological agreements, and the UAE just 2 weeks ago announced $26 billion investment in the US, including technological partnerships. So not only is Trump now not giving any indication that he's going to give that economic vote of confidence, he's also suggesting there will be punitive measures if these allies go elsewhere, if they go to China, if they go to Russia and elsewhere. And that's why I think that although they got away with the tariffs in terms of the manner in which the tariffs were increased, I think one of the reasons being is that Trump wants to give them enough so they keep giving to America, but is not willing to promise anything back. And I actually think that with the announcement of these tariffs, we're now going to see a very complicated process as these capitals, these Muslim capitals, these Middle Eastern capitals, begin to consider how on earth do we adapt, given that we need these financial flows. And the final point worth mentioning here is, it appears that Trump has trampled over established agreements between the Middle Eastern states and between the US. For example, you mentioned Jordan. Jordan has a free trade agreement with the US that's been signed since the 2000s. The free trade agreement implies that these tariffs should not be increased, but Trump increased them anyway. And that suggests that whatever is written on paper with the Americans at this moment in time cannot be taken seriously by these Middle Eastern allies. And at a time when they all believe they need the Americans the most, they are finding that Trump is instead bullying them instead. And I think that it's summarized in the way Trump famously said about a particular Gulf state, where he said, I spoke to their king and I told their king, if it was not for us, Iran would overrun you in 2 weeks. So I'm sorry, king, you gotta pay, you gotta pay. And I think this is going to deeply trouble the Middle Eastern capitals.
And Sami, so I guess, reflecting on the economic side briefly, one argument here that is put forward, and we'll get to it with the UK as well, is that the best of the worst tariffs actually come out looking quite good, because one way to think about it is, anyone that has a 10% tariff on it rather than a big weighty tariff like the Chinese, you will start seeing a lot of inflows into that country as almost like a conduit, as a washing machine to clean, the money and then pass it on to the USA. And we saw that with the Ukrainian war, right? With a lot of the CIS countries, with people like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all of these countries were actually seeing a lot of inflows because people were trying to effectively circumvent sanctions by trading into Russia. So is there an argument that actually, for a country like particularly the UAE, which is already a bit of a hub, this is only going to accelerate that side of things? And so from an economic perspective, that, maybe it's not, obviously it's not ideal because there's a 10% tariff now, but it maybe isn't as bad as, initially might appear. So that's a question for you. And then the other side of it is, what now? Like, with Trump in power, he's going to be there for the next 3-4 years. How do you think that the Middle Eastern countries are going to play their cards, over the next few years? And do you think that there is any chance that they are going to think at a certain point that maybe we do need to move away from the US and we actually do need to start building some ties with someone like a China?
I think as to your first question with regards to countries such as UAE, Qatar and Kuwait, these smaller countries acting as conduits, I think that Trump in his tariffs made one thing clear: conduits will be punished. I think when you look at the increase in tariffs on Vietnam in particular, the increase in Vietnam is in many regards greater than the increase that was imposed on China. And the reason being is that the US believed that Vietnam is the conduit that China was using in order to bypass the tariffs in the first place. What you notice in the tariffs is that there is a targeting of conduits as well. Moreover, you mentioned that as a result of the Ukrainian war, a lot of countries like Uzbekistan, like the UAE as well, they use themselves as conduit for Russian money to essentially, because Russia was sanctioned and the like, the UAE became a conduit. But what also happened is that when the UAE became a conduit, we saw US watchdogs begin to downgrade the UAE economy, begin to downgrade their outlook for the UAE economy, begin to downgrade the UAE with regards to indexes such as money laundering. We saw that the UAE was placed on a grey list with regards to money laundering, and only recently got out of it after exerting strenuous efforts to get itself off that list in the US. And that's why we saw the UAE, where once it was threatening to go elsewhere, we see it now slowly coming back to the US orbit, not because it sees a financial incentive to do so, but because the Americans are looking at these countries that might become conduits. So the answer to that question really depends on how far will Trump go after these conduits. He's gone after Vietnam very hard, precisely because it was a conduit. Will he do the same to the UAE? And I think that depends on the extent of the lobbying that we see in the US, the extent to which the US believes the UAE to be an ally, the extent to which Trump believes the Middle East is an important aspect of his policy. There's an indication that he wants to disengage and that he's not as interested in foreign policy matters in the way that his predecessors were. To what extent is the UAE important in that regard? The second point that you mentioned, the idea of what now and what can they possibly do, I think we're already seeing an indication in terms of what they are doing at this moment in time. Despite knowing that tariffs were coming, despite knowing about Trump's isolationism, despite knowing that Trump is disinclined to encourage Americans to invest abroad, we're still seeing an attempt to appease Trump in the hope that he might give exceptions. And that's why we saw that Saudi Arabia initially announced that they were going to give 500, 600 billion. When Trump said it needs to go higher, they said we're willing to invest $1 trillion in the US economy. They've built factories like Lucid and these other luxury cars in the US, albeit small time, but still the offer of 1 trillion investment in the hope that the Saudis believe that if Trump comes to Saudi Arabia on a visit after the 1 trillion investment or with the promise of a 1 trillion investment, then Trump's presence in Saudi Arabia, his public affirmation of Saudi Arabia, his public assertions that Saudi is an important, valuable economic ally that should be preserved because of this 1 trillion investment that they are investing in the US, Saudis believe that endorsement from Donald Trump, which will mean that companies will say that maybe Saudi can be the conduit, maybe Saudi might be the safe place for investment because their $1 trillion that they gave to Trump has bought them an impunity from what Trump plans to do with other countries elsewhere. And I don't think any other country can compete in that regard. We saw today, at the time of this recording, I know we're live at the moment, but we saw Hakan Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister, with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the US, very warm, hugging each other, holding each other tight, celebrating the warm ties they have between them, pushing for cooperation on Syria, for economic cooperation. We saw Hakan Fidan coming out and saying that Trump is considering lifting sanctions on Turkey and that he's willing to ignore the S-400 missile that led to the sanctions in the first place. We saw Tahnoun bin Zayed, Mohammed bin Zayed's right-hand man of the UAE, sitting next to Donald Trump, promising $26 billion investment in the US to buy that sort of friendship on the basis that Trump's policies will not be led by ideology, even if the tariffs are ideological, but the exceptions will not be led by ideology. Exceptions will be led by personal transactions. And that's why I think that your suggestion that they will look elsewhere, I think it's very similar to Henry Kissinger's famous saying, where he said, it's bad to have America as an enemy. I'm paraphrasing. It's bad to have America as an enemy, but it's even more deadly to have them as a friend. Or rather, or something along those lines. But the point that I'm saying is that the Americans are imposing these conditions on these states that might affect them negatively economically. 1 trillion is not a small number for Saudi Arabia, but he's also refusing them the space to look elsewhere, refusing them the space to go to BRICS, refusing them the space to go to China, refusing them the space to go to Russia. And that's why I think that even if the states choose to go elsewhere, America will not allow it easily. And that's why it looks like for now, they're not choosing provocation. They're not choosing to look elsewhere. They're choosing appeasement in the hope that Trump might give them an exception as he lights the world on fire.
Fascinating stuff, Sami. I want to go to the big C, as it were, in the world very shortly, to Southeast Asia and China, and how China is going to be playing its cards. But reflecting on this overall theme, because I suspect it's going to come up more and more, is, a lot of the countries have gone for, I guess, symbolic, we will make retaliatory tariffs, but ultimately there's a sense that, people are going to go back to Donald Trump and try and appease him. Do you think that this is actually just, and we were discussing this with Mohsin yesterday as well on a separate discussion that we were having, do you think that this is a negotiation tactic by Donald Trump, where he's trying to actually, improve the American position, and that maybe by the end of this election, by the end of this presidency, he's going to be in a position where a lot of the tariffs have disappeared, but or come down significantly, but then also any reciprocal tariffs that have been in place historically have also come down. Do you think this is a negotiation tactic, and there is a logic behind this, or do you think that Trump is doing Trump?
I think that there's often an assertion that Trump is always playing the art of the deal, that these are all about escalation and then de-escalation. But I think that negates the generation that Trump belongs to over the past 25 years, since the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan, wars that were instigated by the Republicans, by the Bush administration, and then the subsequent administrations added to it. I think that if you remember 2003, and I think we're young, but we're reasonably old enough. We're still young, Ibrahim, but we remember some of that period at that time. If you remember 2003, the lust for war, the lust for blood, the lust for sending American troops abroad, for asserting American hegemony, was something that could not be satiated. The Americans were wholeheartedly for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they went in and they went and they bombarded and the like. 25 years since, I think there's been a big shift in the Republican terminology, the Republican discourse, conservative discourse, with regards to the role of America in the world. And I think that's been emphasized given the manner in which the US was kicked out of Afghanistan, the manner in which the US has failed in Iraq, the manner in which the US has failed in Libya, the manner in which whichever conflict zone you look at, where the US has been involved, the US has been quite emphatically either defeated or either failed in what it set out to achieve in the first place, whether on the war on terror or the like. And that's why I think that when you look at Donald Trump, long before he even came to power, you can see that he represents a strand of those Republicans who come out and say, why did we need to do all this in the first place? Why did we waste all this money in the first place? Why did we go and save Kuwait when they didn't even give us any of their oil? Why did we spend all this money and we didn't get anything out of it? Why did we go and spend all those billions of dollars when we could have spent it at home? I don't think that's the art of the deal. I think that's an ideology. I think that's a belief in which Trump looks at the world and he says, I'm not doing favors for anyone anymore. I'm not going to allow USAID and just give free money to the world in order to go and spread, he calls it leftist woke ideology, LGBT, transgender, all this other stuff. Why should I spend money on that? I should be focused on what's happening at home. And that's why I think these tariffs are about more than the art of the deal. They're more than just a negotiation. I think they are a redefining on Trump's terms what the relationship is between America and the world. If you want American power or American solidarity, you have to build your factories in America. You have to hire American workers. You have to put your money in America. Where I think that Trump is misled is that I think that Trump believes the world is taking advantage of America, whereas I argue that the primary people taking advantage of America are actually shareholders and corporations who the excess resources of finances that emerge from the success of companies, they don't get invested back into America, they get invested in buyback options, or they go to the corporate shareholders and they stay with a very minority elite at the expense of the majority of the workers. The money doesn't flow back into the US economy. But putting that aside for a second, I don't think these are just negotiation tactics. I think Trump may make personal exceptions based on whether he likes, he said Erdogan is a good leader. He said, the Qataris, I like them, and they're called Qatar, with not Qatar, showing some sort of, personal relationship and the like. King Abdullah of Jordan, Trump said, I'm going to eviscerate Gaza and make it into a Riviera. King Abdullah of Jordan went to visit him the next day. Afterwards, Trump said it was just an idea. I'm going to wait and see what the Arabs have to present. Trump's policy is always based on the last person that he talked to. But on the point of tariffs, I do think it's an ideological thing. I do think it reflects America trying to be more isolationist. But what I fear the most is if we're looking at these negotiation tactics is the last time America imposed tariffs, the last time they put their walls up, The last time they did so was in the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the way that America emerged out of it was through a world war. What I am worried about more than anything else is that through Trump's imposition of tariffs and then throwing those chips all up in the air, it may be that it's not an economic remedy that will resolve America's economic problems, but that someone who claims to be anti-war may find that historically war resolved the economic problems. Maybe we need a different war, and that's why I think the Chinese and the Europeans are rather concerned with what's happening.
So let's go to China now. So China has not reacted very well to these tariffs, at least publicly. And I suspect it's not great for Chinese manufacture that this has happened. But of course, there's more to things than meet the eye, right, Sami? So we've got another few nuances here. One is, there could be an argument made that actually China and Xi Jinping, is quite happy with what has happened in one sense, because more and more people are going to potentially start thinking about China as the honest broker, or a more suitable superpower to start getting behind, because at least they're predictable, and at least they look after their friends and allies as opposed to America. So maybe there's a silver lining. And there's also the other nuance and complexity here of how much American debt and how much interlinkage economically actually there is between the two countries. And of course, Trump is focused on the trade that is coming and the goods that are coming from China to the US. But then obviously there's a lot of money flowing the other way. And also there's a lot of debt that the Chinese own of the US government as well. So there's all of these crisscrossing webs. And I think China is becoming a lot more assertive, or has been over the last, I guess, decade or so. But I'd love to hear your perspective, with all of these bits and bobs, with all of these, fact points floating around. How is China going to be reacting in the short term, and how do you think it's going to be positioning for the long term?
I think first and foremost, Allah has blessed this ummah with people like you to talk more about the economics, and I'm not going to step onto your turf. I think there are some important geopolitical flashpoints that are quite remarkable for an observer like me. The first is that immediately after Trump announces the tariffs, we see an alliance that we didn't think could emerge. We see China, Japan, and Korea announcing that they're going to come together to start talking about a potential alliance for how to tackle these particular tariffs. China, Japan, and Korea, three parties that despise each other, have now been brought together onto the table because of the US, because of US tariffs, suggesting that for these three countries, and Korea and Japan, often considered satellite states of the US, often considered proxies without offending any one of them, often considered outposts of the US, for them to start talking to China without consulting the US indicates the extent of their concern, but also that on the horizon, they see a possibility for working with China independently of the US. And that's a significant development, particularly given that if it does succeed, it will serve as an example to the rest of the region that there is a way to work with China. And if US is going to retreat, maybe now that that obstacle is out the way, we can now talk to China on our own terms. The second point that is worth noting for the Chinese is that Macron made an interesting statement yesterday in an emergency summit with leading European companies that are invested in the US. And he said to them that they should halt investments and stop any plans to invest in future in the US because, quote, what message does it send to the US that we keep investing in their country when they are attacking us? Something that when I read it, I thought that maybe it would have been very brave for a Muslim leader to say it to Muslim countries with regards to Gaza, where somebody could have stood up and said, guys, we should halt our investments in the US, because what message does it send when Gaza is being butchered, slaughtered, and massacred, and we keep announcing all these investments in the US? But ma'alayna, we don't need to discuss that at this moment in time. Macron's suggestion that European companies need to stop, that Europe now needs to consider its own future, that Europe needs to look beyond the US. We've already seen indication from the Germans. The German foreign minister was in China a few months back. We've seen Europeans increasingly visit the Chinese. We've seen them apologize for diplomatic blunders. We've seen them try to do Keir Starmer went to China to go and speak with Xi Jinping and then was rebuked when he tried to criticize the human rights record and had to have his staff apologize for what he said to Xi Jinping in China. I think that the Chinese, may be concerned about the immediate impact of the tariffs. But I think in the long term, they are the ones who are laughing, because the reality is that even if America might be enticing as an economy, let's suppose for a second that Trump's plans with this tariff is that companies like the German companies like Volkswagen, let's talk about automobiles for a second, like BMW and the like. Let's say his aim is to get them to set up factories in the US, to hire US workers, to build in the US. The question for these companies or for these countries that support BMW and the like is, what do we get out of it? And I think here is where Gaza plays a big role here, because Gaza is demonstrating that the US is not as reliable as an ally as it has been in the past. So when we invest in the hope that we'll get something back, it may well be the US will not give it back, and they'll trample over international order, they'll trample over alliances, they'll trample over friendships, all in order to support their one particular aim. And this goes to your point about China. Do they see China as a more honest broker? This is where China has the ability to take advantage of this gap that the US is leaving by putting up these tariffs, where these European companies will say, as Macron said, I will not invest in a country that's attacking me. Let me go and make a deal with China, because, as Macron once famously said, our problem with China is not US's problem with China. We are Europe, we are independent, we can have our own ties too. So it may well be that China may stand to benefit from it, but it's important to remember that America is a violent power. It's not just an economic power. It's a violent, I don't say military power, it's a violent power. It's a power where if it can't resolve something by law, it will use brute force. And I mean economic and also military force. And I think the extent to which Trump is willing to go to impose that violent force will affect the appetite by which these countries will go towards China. Because if the US has its eyes set on you for war, China will not send troops to rescue you. And I think this is the issue that many countries have when they go to China. It's that, oh, China, I want to invest in a new relationship. I want to be with you, but the US might tear me apart. And China says, that's none of my business. I'm not going in a head-to-head with the Americans. And that's why these countries tend to stay with the US. US is not powerful because of its economy. US is powerful because of its ability to use organized force when other countries look elsewhere. So it remains to be seen, which is why I think in the EU, and I finish on this point, when you're talking about China and alternatives, I think Macron is desperately trying to convince Europe to move towards China, while I think Germany is saying that if we're going to pay for a consequence, let's hold our horses a little bit and see if we can negotiate with Donald Trump. And Keir Starmer is saying that at least we got away with 10%. Let's negotiate with Trump. Maybe we can bring it back down. This is why I think we're still in the phase of appeasement, not in the phase of moving away. And China will wait to see whether that appeasement works before deciding what's the best course of action.
Makes a lot of sense, and I want to come to some of the comments and some of the questions as well shortly, and give the audience a chance to ask their questions as well. It's a very interesting thread that you picked on earlier around Donald Trump is making noises around how he wants to bring manufacture back to the USA. That's the key reason why he's doing this, and I think there's two potential wins that he could have here. One is that he actually manages to bring down global tariffs against the USA, and the customs duties, the import duties that there are in place with various different countries. So I think that's one area. The other area is this manufacture that he wants to bring back to the US, and I think the third area is that he wants a piece of the pie economically when it comes to the tariffs. So he wants more of the taxes. I think those are three very different things, and he's kind of majored on the manufacture coming back and how Americans are taking back control, and this is Liberation Day. But I think if we take each of those three things in turn, I'm not sure what he is doing is going to achieve all of those three goals. So I think the reality is, my view is, and I agree with Mohsin on this as well, that there is going to be this appeasement, and I think ultimately people are going to give way to America, and they're going to bring down their own tariffs, and Trump is going to have a bit of a win as a result of that. The second point, whether or not he's going to see a lot of that money coming into US coffers, I'm not convinced that's necessarily the case, because demand and supply is really going to dictate that. And sure, for more and more machines and goods and plastics that are coming over from China, people will have to pay those tariffs to the US government, but it's unclear if as many of those goods are going to be sold any longer in America, because of the additional price point that these companies are going to have to sell it at in America just to be able to break even. And so because of that, Trump may have effectively slighted himself, because he's getting these taxes, but he's not necessarily going to potentially get as many taxes as he initially thought. And then there's a link to this and the overall US economy, as you said. And this comes to the third point, which is manufacture actually going to come back to the USA? And I kind of think about it from a perspective of the way that we have complex machinery, such as a car, such as compute, and all of the the technological paraphernalia that we see in the world. And the reality is those supply chains are not really in any one country's hand. That's just the fact of the matter. And so for Donald Trump to think that as a result of these tariffs, you're going to see this big shift of manufacture back to the USA, I think is unrealistic, frankly. It might be that you might see it in bits and parts here or there, particularly in the less sophisticated machinery and the less sophisticated goods and machinery that's created. But I'm not sure that you'll see it wholesale. And there's a great documentary that I was watching with the Wall Street Journal, where it was breaking down what goes into building even American vehicles that are now completely, obviously, tariff free. But the reality is that a big chunk of those American vehicles are actually manufactured overseas. A lot of those parts are coming from places like Mexico and Canada and the UK and Germany, and a lot of them also from China as well. And so the unfortunate reality is that in Trump's mind, I think this becomes very simple, but economically, I think it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And then there's an additional factor here, which is the investment side of things, right? So if the countries that you have slapped tariffs on, if those countries decide, like you talked about the UAE, and China is a big investor actually in the US, if those countries decide that, perhaps this is a little bit less of a predictable place and a little bit less of a safe place for us to be putting our money. And we saw what happened with Russian investments that have been held in the US, right? They were seized. This is becoming less of a place that we want to potentially put our money. That means that the overall withdrawal of capital, both investment-wise but also debt-wise, means that you have effectively a cancelling out of any of the potential gains that you had from manufacture coming back to the USA. So all in all, my suspicion is that when it comes to the three things that Trump wants, I do think he's probably going to get a good deal because he's basically bullied other countries, and they're going to appease him because, as you said, they're a violent power and people don't want to stand up against someone who's a lot stronger than they are. I'm not sure he's necessarily going to get much more in terms of resources, just because he might do, but he might not. I think it's going to kind of be break even on the the tariffs that he's going to be able to draw in, and I'm very skeptical that we're going to see a huge shift of manufacture to the US anytime soon. I think it's going to become a lot more complicated than that. But let me take some questions from the audience.
Ibrahim, while you're looking
Go
at
on,
questions as well. I spent a lot of time in America over the past couple of years, and you sit with a lot of the corporate entities. I work with a lot with corporate clients, and you will ask them a question over dinner, and you will say, guys, what's your opinion on these tariffs? What's your opinion on China? What's your opinion on what's going between US and China? And 95% of all of these clients, of all of these corporates that you sit with, they will tell you the issue is not that China or the US or the politics or the like. The issue is when we calculate our investment, our costs, how we make profit, how we make gains. Even with US tariffs, it's more profitable for us to bypass the tariffs and to try to bring from China or to try to bring from these other places, not because there is no manpower in the US and not because there is a lack of infrastructure in the US, but primarily because of the flow of money that happens in the US. And this is the point that I was making, that there is a very interesting statistic that I came across while I was in the US, which is that 90% of profits from those that make stuff in the US, they don't go back, they don't filter down to workers, they don't filter down to society. They're handed to shareholders who then take that money abroad. The problem that Trump has with his tariffs is you've put these walls up to insulate your companies. You've given your companies a competitive edge. They're now making more money. They're now able to compete more effectively. But then the profits that they make do not go back to the American people, nor do they go to the American coffers. And that increase in income inequality, that increase only makes your problem even worse. And the issue I think that Trump has, on top of all those that you highlighted, is how do you fix that? Because tariffs could work if you fix this income inequality. But Trump has shown no indication that he's willing to. And the proof is the way he's appointed Elon Musk. It's the way that he's entertained those big, tycoons and the big dons. And that's why I think that Trump likes the idea of tariffs and likes the idea of making America great again. But I think that the alternating of the financial system, which is very parasitic in the US, I think that's where he's really going to find a problem, but he'll probably blame China for it.
Yeah, I think it's we can pick on that, I guess, when we circle back to the US in our whistle stop tour around the world in just a second. But I think Itachi has a very interesting question. He's asking, is the world order being renegotiated with Russia and China having a bigger say in world institutions, or will it be China that's setting up its own institutions like BRICS, etc.? What do you think, Sami?
I think that historically, when you look at the rise of new powers, we have a world today where you have the US, Russia, and China, who are the main powers, and there's often a suggestion that the three of them will renegotiate the global order between themselves. And, people like to talk about BRICS or the like. But the reality is that, as a Muslim, for example, you had the Romans and the Persians, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam emerged out of nowhere from between them. And in the space of 100 years, the dynamics changed completely. And suddenly you had the Persians on one side, no longer as powerful as they once were. And you had the Byzantines on the other, who are no longer as powerful as they once were. And this was just an explosion in the middle of Arabia. When you look at the Mongols and how they emerged, you had your established powers. You had the Yuan dynasty in China. You had the other established, the Abbasids. You had the big empire and the like. And the Mongols emerged out of nowhere and completely transformed the world order in less than 50 years. And I think that sometimes why I'm hesitant these days to talk about things within the framework of today is because no one knows what will happen tomorrow. And I know that sounds weird saying it as an analyst who's asked by companies to do forecasting and scenarios and the like. But I think that when you look at Russia, Ukraine has drained Russia economically. The reason Assad fell in Damascus is because the Russians were so distracted by Ukraine, they did not follow the developments in Syria, and of course Iranian proxies were weakened. Assad fell, you have a new government, nobody knows how to handle this new government in Damascus. Trump doesn't know what to do, neither do the Israelis, neither do the Saudis, neither do the Europeans or the like. It's an anomaly that emerged out of nowhere. If we look at, for example, at the Chinese, yes, economically they're a big power, but they've yet to flex political weight. They've yet to go head-to-head with the Americans. Their law is not to go head-to-head with the Americans. They've invested, yes, in Africa and the like, but we haven't seen a flexing of the political weight. And when we talk about the world order being renegotiated, Trump is not talking to the Chinese about a renegotiation of the global order. Trump is talking about how to subjugate China and make it second to the US. Trump is talking to Putin to tell him, can you give me peace while I focus on America inside to make it into a hegemon? And that's why I think that these terms about renegotiating a global order, I understand that it makes sense when we talk about geopolitics like it's a game. But I also think, and perhaps this is a controversial point to make, I do believe in what I call divinity in politics, which is you plan and Allah plans. And that's why I think that more than looking at whether the global order is being renegotiated, I think it's more about what are the opportunities that are now showing themselves while this global order is being redesigned, reordered, not in the fashion that people want, but in the fashion that circumstances dictate. What role can you play in refashioning and renegotiating this particular world? And just to emphasize this point, and I'll finish here. Ibrahim, you asked me and you said, what stops nations from pursuing their own policy? I think what stops nations pursuing their own policy is a simple thing. To resist American hegemony or global order hegemony or Russians and the like, requires a painful rebirth process. It's like giving birth to a new child. Not that I know anything about it, but my wife knows much about it. That pain requires a patience and perseverance in your social contract with the people. The people have to be on board and ready to struggle with you through this process, through this redesigning of the economy to remove the dependency on the US. In an age where we're taught that success is wealth, a Tesla, a house, a money, wealth, being a millionaire and the like, that social contract does not allow for a weaning of dependency, because the required struggle to move the economy off, the people will not be patient with you through that process. And that's why I think for any country to move away, it's not about moving towards China. China is a means. It's not the way to move away. The means to move towards China, the means to move away from the US, requires a leader to be honest with their people and say, we're going to go through a bit of economic pain. It might be a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, but by the end of it, we will be richer as a result of our independence. And I think many people in the Middle East, in the Muslim world and beyond, are not willing to do that for the sake of any leader present at this moment in time. And the Americans know it, which is why when a leader tries to do it, there are immediate sanctions, the currency drops, the economy gets worse. And the reaction of the people, Ibrahim, this is my point. The reaction of the people, it's not go, we're with you, you keep doing it because we know that if we wean ourselves, we'll be a stronger economy. The reaction is, yeah, jahil, you stupid leader. You now made it more expensive to buy an iPhone. You now made it more expensive for us to travel to Greece. You now made it more expensive for us to go to America. If you can't find a way to do this comfortably, then respect the global order and let Russia, China, US negotiate it. And we're happy to be vassals because we feel like we can enjoy those comforts. I think that's the real economic problem that a lot of these countries have whenever they talk about moving away from the US.
I want to come back to this, Sami, at the end, where we talk about, what are these opportunities and how we as Muslims should be potentially playing the next few years with everything up in the air and up for grabs as well, if we think of it as an opportunity. But I wanted to pick your brains about the position of the UK, Europe, and Russia. Like, where do these countries stand vis-a-vis the United States today? Because some people are saying that Europe is now, for the first time, effectively gearing up for a war. You're seeing defense budgets going up. You're seeing that the European countries are coming together. United Kingdom seems to be a lot more friendlier with Europe again for the first time in a while. And Europe has been slapped with a pretty heavy tariff relative to the UK as well, which is, I guess, I don't know how expected or unexpected it was, but the UK, I think, is quite happy to have survived it. And then in parallel, you've got Russia, kicking off in the background, and there's this odd, uneasy, slightly, Jekyll and Hyde kind of relationship going on between Trump and Putin. How do we make sense of this? And where are we going to see another world war coming out of Europe again?
I think that these are very uncertain and chaotic times. And I think, and I don't want to be sensationalist in this particular analysis, but one of the things that you notice when you read the build-up to World War I is that none of the powers were expecting it. There were policies of appeasement. There wasn't really an investment in defense budgets. There wasn't really an anticipation that there might be a world war. There wasn't this sense that the economic chaos would lead to a war on the scale as what we saw in the build-up to World War II. World War I is one case, but in this case, I'm referencing World War II. The reason why I say this is that I still think the Europeans are sleepwalking. When you look at the reactions, Macron has made bold statements before about NATO and the like, but hasn't really reacted to it, hasn't really altered his priorities, hasn't been able to push Europe towards a more independent policy. Instead, Macron has found backlash from Germany, from Belgium, from these other European Union countries that have told him you're exaggerating, you're being sensationalist, we have to develop our ties with the US. And I think that the lack of European imagination was reflected when I think it was the NATO Secretary General at the Munich conference. He burst into tears at what Trump and JD Vance were saying in a very humiliating display for somebody who should be presenting a very strong front that the future is fine and we can actually come up to it. I think that when Keir Starmer talks about raising the defense budget while simultaneously appeasing Trump, it makes you wonder whether Keir Starmer is doing it in anticipation of actually developing UK defenses, or rather to give an indication to Trump to say, yes, Emperor, I'm raising money for defense. Can you now cut me some slack on tariffs? Can you cut me some slack on trade? I need to make Brexit work because, I took down Jeremy Corbyn, who wanted, to stay in Europe, and I need to look good for it. I think that the Europeans lack imagination. I think that they've been following the US for so long that they don't know what the next path looks like. And that's why I think when you read European statements, they're so contradictory. No one knows exactly what the Europeans are going to do. And as for Ukraine, I think Ukraine summarizes it. Trump brings Zelensky in a very humiliating press conference for Zelensky, where J.D. Vance tells him, you haven't even said thank you even once. A very strange thing for something you'd expect from a 5-year-old. But in any case, when Trump announces that he's bullying Zelensky into a deal with Russia and says that Zelensky's unpopular, needs to step down, the Europeans don't rush to aid Zelensky. What they start doing is negotiating the terms of the ceasefire, negotiating the terms of the surrender, negotiating the terms of what the deal that Trump might suggest to the Russians. There's no stance of Europe to say, no, this is on our border, this is something serious that we're going to handle. There's a sense of we'll follow where the American position is and we'll adapt. And that's why I think that, can Europe imagine a future without the US? I think there is no current European statesman that can, or stateswoman that can. And I think that Europe now finds itself in a very difficult situation. And as you mentioned earlier, it's more likely they will appease than resist. And I think that's the attitude that we're seeing. That's the attitude we're seeing in the UK. And Trump knows this. And I think this is the biggest dilemma of all of this. It's that Trump knows all of this. Trump knows the world is more likely to bend over for him than it is to resist him. And that's where I think the tragedy lies, in that I think that the Europeans have the power to stand up to the US, but they choose not to, because for all the talk of a union, they are so badly divided that Trump picks them off one by one.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think I want to come back to a question that I'm seeing in the chat as well from Shazan, which I will do in due course. But I wanted to come to the US itself, Sami. What do you think is going to happen in the USA itself over the next few years? Given everything that we are seeing that Trump is doing from a foreign policy perspective, he seems to be very focused internationally. And I'm not sure if he's as focused domestically, and how how that's going to have a bearing on what happens. We saw the recent election that took place where it was, I think they were saying it was the most funded election for a legislative seat, a judiciary seat, and Elon Musk, I think, put in a big chunk of money, tens of millions of dollars, and ultimately the Democrat won in that seat, and it was seen as some people were saying that it was seen as a bit of a vote on where the country stands right now with vis-a-vis what Trump is doing. But yeah, interested to hear your thoughts about how you think the USA is going to shape up over the next, let's say, 4 or 5 years.
I think that first and foremost, it's important to remember that America is an isolated society. I think that when you go to America, you realize many of them are unaware of what's happening in the world, are unaware of the intricacies of foreign policy, and in many cases, they really just don't care. And across my travels in America, I used to think it was a stereotype, but there are a lot of people who you meet who've never left America, or the only place they've been when they left America was Mexico. There is a genuine bubble that exists in America, in that if you were to walk down the aisle of a plane flying from, for example, from Washington to California, you will see half the plane watching CNN and the other half watching Fox News, and whoever is not watching either of them is watching Netflix. There's not really an engagement in terms of what's happening in foreign policy. American politics is ruled by what happens in America, not what happens outside. And foreign policy only affects American public opinion insofar as it affects their own lives. The reason why I start with this is that America could radically change in the next 4 or 5 years for one primary reason. I think that as social media becomes the main source of news, Americans are now exposed to the reality as it is, as opposed to the filter that a lot of these channels used to give them. And we saw it with Gaza, for example, where now we're seeing this wave take place, where the crackdown that we're seeing on students, or the crackdown on social media, is a bid by Zionists in order to recreate the barrier between reality and the Americans. It's the ability to regain the territory, that bridge between reality and the Americans, because social media is given a direct insight into what the world looks like, America's role in it, and just how much America is spending on it. Which is why now one of Trump's biggest issues that he has at this moment in time is that his base are increasingly seeing that Israel has a big role to play in politics. That despite the fact he's talking about America first, he's giving $8 billion to the Israelis in terms of arms, allowing them to continue the genocide and the like. And the reaction of the conservative base, whether it's Tucker Carlson, whether it's Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson described by the New York Times as the most influential right-wing podcaster on the conservative base, is coming out and saying, we need to talk about the influence that these people have on our politics. That's because that bridge has been taken away from the Zionists and it's been conquered by social media that allows that direct contact. The reason why I say this is, I remember an incident when I was in California. I found myself on a table with MAGA supporters. Don't ask. So I remember it was a young Muslim told me, Sami, would you like to hear what they really think? So I said, yeah, sure, let's go. So I went and I met with them. And he was arguing to me and saying, Sami, conservatives are not becoming pro-Palestinian. Even when they're criticizing Israel, they're not becoming pro-Palestinian. What's happening is that Gaza is demonstrating the extent to which their government is held ransom by foreign interests. That's what's upsetting the Americans. They're looking at their broken healthcare system and saying, why are we giving money abroad when I can't afford healthcare? They're looking at their housing situation and saying, I can't afford housing, but why are we giving all this money to a nation that has free healthcare or the like? This is what could radically change the Americans. In the last election, 15 million Americans didn't vote. According to the YouGov poll, at least 30% of those who didn't vote, the reason they didn't vote was because of Gaza. Not because they support the Palestinians, but because Gaza for them demonstrated that these two politicians, Harris and Trump, do not represent me, nor do they represent America. They represent foreign interests. If that is 15 million people who sit out the vote, and the difference in the vote was 3 million, all indications suggest that that polarization between the people and government will only increase. How that plays out in America, whether it becomes civil war, whether it's represented in less people taking part in elections, whether it talks about, increased spotlight on lobbies or the like, is unclear. What is clear is that America is changing, not because of what Trump is doing, but America is changing because people are becoming increasingly aware of what's happening around them. And that's what I think Trump's biggest problem is. Witkoff, the negotiator for the Gaza between the Israelis and the Hamas. So Witkoff gave an interview with Tucker Carlson. And in it, Witkoff is describing the challenges of fighting the lobby, the challenges of trying to bring the parties together. We saw Adam Bola, the envoy, saying that he's talking directly to Hamas, that he's talking directly to the groups, and that he said, they're not bad guys, they're not guys with horns. And when he was asked, but isn't Israel upset about it? He said, we are Americans who look for American interests. We're not an agent of Israel. Something unprecedented. And he said this on Fox News. The reason why I'm saying this is this shift in public opinion is what leads to Trump's knee-jerk reaction, ceasefire, genocide, peace talk, genocide, and the like. All indications are that if these tariffs don't bring the economic benefit that Trump wants for the Americans, it's hard to imagine the Americans taking it lying down. And it's harder to imagine the Americans staying quiet when every day on their social media, they're seeing where their tax dollars are going instead. They're seeing that we're saying that we're America first, but we're actually Israel first, or we're actually donors first, or we're actually billionaires first. And that showed in the elections. Gaza swung the election in those 6 swing states. In the next election, it may not be Gaza or Palestine. It may be the realization that America doesn't belong to Americans. It belongs to foreign interests, and we truly need to take America back. And that might force the reckoning. And we're already seeing increasing voices saying that. It may be a slow process, but what the point is, you asked what will America look like in 4 or 5 years' time. I think if this trend continues, if in 15 or 17 months, 15 months until the election, 15 months until it was the election in November, in 15 months, 15 million Americans sat out the election because of what they discovered on social media. Mathematically, it suggests that in 5 years, more people will have things to say about the elections that might dramatically alter the Americans. And I finish on this point. We often talk about America as if it's been a hegemon for 300, 400 years. America has only been a hegemon, in my opinion, for 30 years. Because after it emerged from 1945, its rival was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s. Americans struggled to win over the world. In 1990, they became the hegemon. We're now 2025. That's about 35 years. It's a very recent phenomenon that America is a hegemon, which suggests that it's a fragile state of hegemony that can come crashing down as well. It's not a permanent state. And I think if you view American hegemony from this perspective, then the consequences of these tariffs, the consequences of Trump, the consequences of the change in public opinion, the consequences of these economic policies, these questions that are being asked about the renegotiation of the global order, you find these are not new questions. These are questions that have been asked in the same generation 30 years ago, which implies that a lot of change that we don't know or we can't imagine will happen could happen in the next 5 years. And I think, as you said earlier, it's about not about what will happen, but more about when it happens, are you ready to take advantage of those opportunities? And I think that's why organizations like yours and others, they're engaged in talking about how to take advantage of these opportunities. And only Allah knows what will happen next.
Well said, Sami. Let's talk a little bit about. I want to just reflect on a few points around the inequality point that you talked about, which I think is a fascinating one. And ultimately, no one really knows where the cookie is going to crumble, but I think that's going to be a really important thread throughout all of this. And then I want to round off with a question from the chat, and then I want to really just let you expand on something you said earlier around the opportunities that there could be that present themselves here. So on the economic side with the USA, Donald Trump is a billionaire and he is surrounded by billionaires. And ultimately, what he is doing, I think, is potentially going to create more of a divide for all of the reasons that you've said, between the rich, between the billionaires, and between those who voted to get Donald Trump in, because he promised them that he's going to make America great again. And I think if that is the case, then I think we're going to see Donald Trump could actually well end up between a rock and a hard place, because either he is going to have to really double down on the racist rhetoric and really double down on the same stuff that in part I think got him in, the far right narrative, and distract away from the economic side and blame the migrants even more, or he is going to have to face up to it. And I think facing up to it is really just not really going to be an option, because it's going to mean ideologically a fundamental reset in how he thinks about economics, right? And it's going to mean that you have to just go to the people who have the money, which is the corporates in America, and get them to redistribute, which, given that he is a billionaire backed by billionaires, is going to be a tricky one. And I think for me, that's actually quite a scary thought, because if you are going to go further than someone like Peter Hegseth, who is apparently he's got tattoos that are anti-Muslim, and he's been on record saying death to the Muslims. If you've got someone like him and you're thinking that actually you want to go even more far right than that in order to stave off this crisis of your own making, that to me is quite a concerning thought. So I want to kind of reflect on that. I wanted to now come to Shazan's question. Shazan's asking around whether or not he thinks, or I don't actually know, I guess Shazan must be a man, right? Sami, I don't know. Is it a male name? Anyway, Shazan is asking whether or not tariffs could be a negotiating tool to force countries to tie their currencies to the dollar in a new Bretton Woods type agreement. He's thinking that this could be an idea to weaken the dollar to help the US become competitive in manufacturing and yet keep the US dollar as a reserve currency. And does the Trump administration even have the trust to be in a position to negotiate such a deal? I think there's, frankly, there's an economic aspect and there's a geopolitical aspect to this as well. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well, Sami. But on the economic side, really, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen with the dollar. I think yesterday, I've not checked the pound since, but the pound was actually really strong for the first time against the dollar. So the dollar has weakened, right, as it were. But what's ultimately going to drive where the dollar ends up is whether or not the amount of trade that was done and the amount of imports into the US that were flowing through, whether or not those slow down on one part. So if they slow down, then there isn't going to be as much supply of US dollars and as much exchange of US dollars happening, which you would expect to actually strengthen the dollar in the short term. And then at the same time, you've got the US investments that are being made by all of the different, all of the international community. And if you see those continuing, then actually that's great, because there's plenty of demand for the dollar and that will kind of cancel it out. But if you see that drying up, then again you see effectively a negation of the strengthening of the dollar, and you effectively end up in the same place. So I think there's basically multiple movements that could be happening here, and it's coming back to the same point I was making earlier, which is that you've almost got three different objectives that Donald Trump is trying to achieve, either implicitly or explicitly, and it's not straightforward, and they're not all necessarily going to be achieved in the same way. And it could be that trying to achieve one actually negates some of the other ones, namely trying to negotiate a better tariff deal with the rest of the world, trying to get manufacture to come to the USA, and trying to raise tax receipts from the tariffs that have been put on. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Sami, as well, and then we'll talk about the future and the potential opportunities here as well.
In January this year, Donald Trump said that he threatened nations that are thinking of replacing the dollar with tariffs. He also said that nations that are thinking of BRICS, the US will not allow this to take place, and the US will not allow nations to replace the dollar, suggesting an acute awareness that nations are thinking about replacing the dollar, and threatening and using US leverage to ensure that this does not happen. So I think that the idea that this might be a consideration is not far-fetched. Where I do question whether the current manner in which the dollar is being weakened is something intended by Trump, I think one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to suggest that it's a grand plan is because of the leaks of Elon Musk crying to Donald Trump that the Tesla stock was rapidly crashing, and also the interview that Musk gave about the Minnesota governor, Waltz, who came out and was laughing about the Tesla stock crumbling, and Elon Musk said, "Who laughs about that? He's such a jerk." And the news that Elon Musk might leave the government in order to go and rescue Tesla. The idea being that it may well be that if Trump has a plan, he hasn't told his corporate allies about it. And if Trump doesn't have a plan, then the corporate allies are struggling as a result of it in watching their stock prices suddenly collapse and the like in a recession. And I often understand the sentiment that sometimes people like to think of things as like a grand plan, the grand plan to bring the dollar down, to make manufacturing easier. But sometimes people just blunder. Sometimes people do things and don't realize the consequences exactly of what it is that they are doing. I'm not sure if Trump is intending to weaken the dollar. Trump wants to make America more competitive, but it's unclear whether he's fully thought it out. And I think one of the signs of it is some of the tariffs are a bit unusual in terms of the countries that he's imposed them on and countries that he hasn't imposed those tariffs on. So I think, and I also think that even if the dollar weakens, I think that the demand for US goods is not necessarily as high as goods are from other nations as well. I think Trump's biggest issue is that people get more money out of America than they put in America. It's a recognition that people are not getting as much out of America, but they're not putting as much in America, but they're getting more out of America, and he wants to flip that. I think even weakening the dollar, it doesn't necessarily make US goods competitive, because I think the issue is more broader than just the dollar. I think the issue is something broader than that. And I think that Trump, if he has a grand plan, it seems to be his own and not those of his allies. And I think his allies are arguing between themselves whether this plan is even a good idea or not.
Sami, these are choppy times, choppy territory, choppy waters. We, in amidst all of this, for entrepreneurs in particular, but also for Muslims, you are always optimistic, and there is opportunity here as well. And I was saying when we were discussing with with Mohsin yesterday that the reality is I don't think anyone knows what's really going to happen next, because there are so many variables that have just been thrown into the air, that in a way what we have to do is, we've had this geopolitical order, the fabric of the world has been rent, and what lies behind it is unclear. And in many ways, the people who move the fastest and are able to just experiment and poke the holes through these different rents and figure out where the honey lies, and then double down on that, and establish infrastructure around that in a a reconstruction of that geopolitical world order or economic order. I think they'll do the best out of it from an economic perspective. I'd love to hear your thoughts about where do you think the opportunities lie, and for an average Muslim, what should they be doing?
I think that first and foremost, I think there is a beauty about uncertainty. And what I mean is, I don't mean the chaos and the like. I mean, uncertainty means that there is always the prospect of opportunity and possibility. And because it is uncertain for everyone, it makes it worth pursuing, because there is no certainty it will fail and every chance that it might succeed. And that's why I think that it was very interesting when I was younger. For me, Islam is just as political as it is social. There was an Imam once told us a story about Imam Malik. Imam Malik saw the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in a dream, and he asked him, Ya Rasulullah, when will I die? So the Prophet ﷺ apparently did this to him in the dream, 5. So when he asked about the dream, somebody said to him that the dream means that the Prophet ﷺ was referring to 5 things that belong to Allah alone. That in Allah indu ilmu sa'a, Allah knows when the hour will come. وَيُنَزِّلَ الْغَيْثِ, and sends the rain. وَيَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْأَرْحَامِ, and knows what is in the womb. وَمَا تَدْرِي نَفْسٌ مَاذَا تَكْسِبُ غَدًا وَبِأَيِّ أَرْضٍ تَمُوتُ وَلَا تَدْرِي نَفْسٌ بِأَيِّ أَرْضٍ تَمُوتُ. That nobody knows where they will die or what earth they will die. Meaning, Imam Malik, don't bother about the certainty of what will come. Rather, conduct yourself based on the uncertainty and you will win in the end. And I think that's the same for every Muslim, whether it's in political activism, whether it's entrepreneurship and the like. And the reality is that we see Muslims doing extraordinary things with extraordinary companies, with extraordinary ideas. We're seeing people develop new independent technology. We're seeing people develop big businesses, and we're seeing them talk about how they can empower the Muslim world in this as well. And many of them making avenues in those areas as well, being able to succeed not only in the Western world, but also in the Muslim world, establishing those ties and making it economically viable to invest in something that is more Muslim. By that, what I mean is something that more accurately represents the principles of justice in a way that Western values has been unable to do so. And I think that as more people begin to, I say retreat because that's what some people are feeling like, even though I don't think it's a retreat, I think it's a return. As they retreat into the values that they were brought up with, there is a very good book that I recommend everybody to read. It's called Inescapable Questions by Ali Izetbegovic, who was the Bosnian president during the war in the 1990s. He was asked by a European journalist during the war, what is it, Alia, that makes you believe that we can all live together when Croatia wants a Croat state, Serbia wants a Serbian state, but you talk about how everybody can live together, the Muslims, the Croats, and the Serbians, and the like. How do you hold on to your European Western values in the midst of these fires? And Alia responds and he says that it's not the European values that I'm holding on to. European values is genocide, it's Holocaust, it's this ethnic cleansing, it's the displacement of Palestinians, of those, the Inquisition and the like. It is my Muslim values that tell me that we can live side by side, the way we did in Andalusia, the way we did in Sarajevo, the way we did in Jerusalem when the Muslims ruled it too. This return to this more values-based, the idea that I should make money not for money's sake, but to promote a grander cause, to promote righteousness, justice, to promote a community of righteousness. I think that the opportunity that's being presented is that in the disintegration of the global order as we know it, in the self-destruction of an international order that was built by Western powers themselves, I think more people are now thinking about what new realities could look like, what new orders could look like. And that is what is encouraging more people to strive in business, to strive in politics, to strive in dawah, to strive in activism, to strive for what's right. And that's what's creating the opportunities. That's what's creating new avenues through which to be able to push for what's right and what's just. It's allowing for more cracks in the alliances of evil, as you would like to call it, and more promotion of cooperation in that which is good. And that's why I think that it's not China, Russia, and the US that will renegotiate the global order. It is the people and the way that they live. The reason I talk about income inequality when we talked about the US is because it's not just an economic term, it's a political and social term. If a family is getting poorer and the TV is telling them they're getting better and they can't afford rent, they can't afford healthcare, they can't afford to go to school, they can't afford education, this is what leads to the collapse of society. It's an oppressive society. And that's why we see now people, companies, entrepreneurs, we're seeing people emerge who are trying to offer a different vision. The reason why I'm saying this is the opportunity is because I don't know how that will manifest. I don't know what that looks like in 5-10 years time. I don't know what that looks like in 15 years time. I know that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in his propagation of an alternative vision, in his use of entrepreneurs like Abdurrahman ibn Auf and like Umar ibn Khattab and these others, in his use of pushing activism like Mus'ab ibn Umayr and like Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, with all of these resources, he still got to a stage where he said, Mata Nasrullah, when is the victory of Allah coming? But he kept going because Allah knows the certainty in what you think is uncertainty. And I think that's the opportunity. The opportunity is in the uncertainty. If the evil powers do not know or are not comfortable with how things are developing, if they can't predict what it would look like in 10-15 years, if Trump has to impose tariffs because he's not comfortable with his economy, if Russia has to invade Ukraine because it's not comfortable in its borders, if we see all of these people who are uncertain, that should suggest there is something, there is a reason why they are uncertain. And the reason why they are uncertain is because there are dynamics out of their control. And if there are dynamics out of their control, it means they do not dictate the future. The future is dictated by those who keep going and moving for what's right, because that movement creates opportunities from where it didn't exist. And that's why I go back to the point I mentioned earlier to finish off. When you suggested China, America, or the like, the reason why I love history is because history shows you that when the Mongols were at their peak, when they almost obliterated the Muslim civilization, a small army by Saifuddin Qutuz defeated them in Ain Jalut and suddenly caused the whole spectacular reversal where the Mongols not only left, they became Muslim and carried Islam back to the lands that they conquered. No one at the time thought that Saifuddin Qutuz would be the one to drive the Mongols back. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is between two superpowers, Ibrahim. The equivalent of today would be, I don't want to insult the Prophet ﷺ in any way whatsoever. I won't give a country, but it's a country where if I pointed to it today and said, this is going to be the new superpower, you'd be like, come on, Sami, like get off it. Like this is an exaggeration. In the space of a generation, they come out of the desert and they become the superpower. The Mongols emerge from nowhere between the Chinese and the Abbasids. History shows that an explosion happens at any time where the dynamics change completely. Things go in cycles. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. Allah says it, meaning opportunities will always come. People said Asad would stay for a whole lifetime. He fell within 10 days. No one knows how these opportunities will manifest. What we do know is as long as you move, as long as you keep going and dreaming, as long as you keep having a vision, as long as you keep trying, as long as you keep pursuing that which is right. And what I love, and I'll say this, you didn't ask me to say it, nor did you pay me for this whatsoever. What I love about Islamic Finance Guru is that it's clear it's not about money making. It's about empowerment. There's a clear difference between the two, which is why I think Allah has given you a success. And my warning to you is that's the reason for your success. If you change it to the other way, you will lose. It's a rule. It's categorical. It's the way that divinity works. But my point is that as long as people keep moving for the sake of empowerment, for the sake of what's right, the water will keep flowing. And when the water keeps flowing, it starts clearing. And when it becomes clear, you start seeing what's on the bottom of it. And when you put your hand in, you know where the diamond or the pearl is. You don't need to look for it. It's there because the water is clear, because you kept moving. And that's why I think there is opportunity. There is opportunity because the powers that we think define the global order are uncertain about the future. And that is the opportunity in and of itself. If they are uncertain, don't be certain about their power. Embrace their uncertainty, because their uncertainty is built on a fear that they will not have power in the near future. So move based on that and watch the opportunities that are created.
Allahu Akbar. I think really, really powerful words. I think if I reflect on what you're saying, at the heart of it, it's about action and moving to action, having optimism, having a bit of a backbone, and having bravery, and all of that actually comes from the people. Because if we as a community globally, as a Muslim community, we start having that optimism, that bravery, that inclination towards action rather than overly cogitating over things and thinking about things, then I think we create a different type of culture. And I think it's actually culture really at the heart of it, which then ferments a different type of approach to all of this kind of thing. And I think at one point in this conversation, you talked about how Trump knows that no one is really going to stand up to him. And I think that's a reflection of American culture. Like really, Americans, there are many things that are problematic about them, such as, the oversized fast foods and all of that stuff. But actually, the Americans, they're very optimistic. They're very inclined towards action. They're very brave in many ways. They're happy to take risks. They're happy to throw punches and ask questions later. And I think it's that kind of cultural attitude, which we as Muslims, but also underpinned by our own ethics, which unfortunately I think many in America, are sadly, lacking, because they don't necessarily have the light of Islam that is there to guide them. If we can combine that culture but with that kind of pristine ethics, then I think there's a lot of opportunity. And I'd say specifically to the entrepreneurs out there, because I think the world is driven in part by a lot of entrepreneurs and the infrastructure that they build, especially today where even warfare is going towards technology. I think one important theme that perhaps we've not really talked about is AI and artificial intelligence, because the more companies are pushed on tariffs and costs, the more they're going to turn towards AI, and the more AI is going to develop as a whole. So I think where there could be a major rupture in just the entire world order is if there is some kind of critical mass that is reached around AI in and around a certain location or geography or group of people, which fundamentally just changes the entire dynamic. And I actually think these tariff wars have made that far more likely to happen than ever before. So I think the focus of entrepreneurs should be around new and emergent technologies. The printing press, when it didn't exist, Europe was in its dark ages, and within just a few hundred years, arguably down primarily to the printing press, you see the European countries in their ascendancy. So technologies can be literally a light bulb, right? And like the light bulb itself was a great invention. So technologies, I think, can be the thing that can switch things overnight. And of course, it needs to be aligned with iman, and it needs to be aligned with a fertile political landscape for that thing to take root. But my personal message to people is that the game is afoot, and actually more than ever before, it's all to play for. What Trump has done is he's taken a big sledgehammer to the existing political order, this cement wall that we had, that we think weak Muslims could not change. But now, even if we might think that we're weak or not, the wall is broken. And for the first time, we should have that self-empowerment to be able to think about how we're going to build it for the future. Sami, any last words before we wrap up?
My problem is if I say too much, you won't invite me again, Ibrahim. I need to hold some back to make sure I'm able to come again, inshallah. May Allah bless you, Habib. Thank you very much for having me.
Hayakallah, hayakallah. Jazakallah khair, everyone, for tuning in and for all of your comments. And inshallah, we'll get Sami back very, very shortly back because Trump is going to do something crazy next week anyway, Sami. So we're going to have to get your guidance on that.
We'll be there.
Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.